After a few hours, Piggy and the others returned to the academy, and somewhere in the academy was Professor Banshee Morgie's research office. Dollars entered the office, placed her hands on top of the table, and with an angry gaze, began staring intently at the professor, asking why he had not published her article. She had written the truth as it was. She couldn't believe that he had published an article criticizing Night Bloodhound instead of hers. Professor Banshee, who had his hands clasped together, began staring back at her intently, questioning if she was asking this because she didn't know the truth. He explained that her article had been quite offensive to certain groups, reminding her that the Academy maintained a politically neutral stance. Even though she was somewhat furious, she remained silent and listened without interrupting. The professor took out an article from a drawer, placed it on top of the table, and slid it toward her with his hand. This article accused Night Bloodhound of committing terrorism and bringing darkness to the Quo Vadis family. With a serene voice, she mentioned again that she had written the facts as they were. The professor closed his eyes, turned his head to the other side, sighed and argued that her father, Cardinal Humbert, had denied all these facts, and furthermore the leading figures of society who were on the list of indulgences had also declared that the information was not true. Dolores' eyes filled with sadness and distrust. She began to gaze at the ground, explaining that all the information was in the Book of Indulgences. The professor raised his head and with a calm expression responded that the origin of the book was not very clear. Her mind filled with questions, questioning why he was on Quo Vadis' side and if he was being pressured by someone external. The professor's gaze filled with surprise. He went on alert upon seeing that she was getting closer to the truth. He stood up, moved the chair aside using his hand, and began staring at her intently, deciding there was no need to lie. He had been told to focus this article on the terrible act of terrorism committed by the Night Bloodhound, revealing that thanks to her, the dean was also quite perplexed. Upon hearing this, Dolores' expression changed drastically. She started touching her arm out of nerves and began looking at him with a surprised look, not fully understanding what he meant. She remained calm, asking if Cardinal Humbert was so powerful that even the dean of the academy could get into trouble. The professor grabbed his nose and with a confident smile mentioned that if it had only been Cardinal Humbert, there would have been no way for the dean to listen to him in the first place. Dolores' expression turned surprised. She couldn't help but go into shock and realize what was really happening. She began to imagine the Pope of the Church smiling, finally realizing that there was only one person in Quo Vadis who was superior to Cardinal Humbert, and that person was none other than the Pope himself. She placed her hands over her chest and with an empty gaze began to think in silence. Even though everyone else was corrupt, she firmly believed that he was not someone who would lose his integrity. She had heard many people say that his judgment had become a bit blurry as he aged. She didn't know if Cardinal Humbert was taking this opportunity to cover the Pope's eyes and ears from the church. With a serene expression, the professor snapped his fingers and began pointing at her with his finger, arguing that, first of all, her article was not suitable for publication in a newspaper since while reading it, he couldn't help but get the impression that she was secretly siding with the Night Bloodhound, reminding her that he was someone bad who had committed terrorism. Dollars could not avoid feeling internal rage, but even so, she showed no emotion, firmly thinking that the Night Bloodhound was not someone bad, rather the bad ones were Quo Vadis and the demon hiding within the family. The day before leaving, Vakar revealed to her that demons still remained in the world. He had been fighting a difficult battle alone, and there were going to be many more in the future. Today, after speaking with Professor Banshee, she believed she knew why the Night Bloodhound risked his life to kill demons without letting people know. She turned her back to the teacher and started walking towards the door. He began to look at her and asked her not to delve further into this. She opened the door with her hand and promised not to do so. her eyes filled with determination. She also decided to help the night hound so that he would not fight alone. Tudor, who was stretching his arms, closed his eyes and concentrated, making his whole body tremble. He started walking next to Sancho, and while stretching his arms due to exhaustion, he explained that it had been a while since he had gone to class. So now he was exhausted. Now he knew why volunteering work was a good option for him. Sancho, who was next to him, began observing him with a confused gaze, thinking that this guy was very strange. In front of them was Piggy, with a cheerful expression. He turned towards Vakar, promising to go together next time. Vakar started walking silently without saying a single word. Tudor approached our boy, placed his hand on his shoulder, and with a kind look mentioned that today he was going to practice Neftali, asking if he wanted to go with them. Vakar didn't even look him in the eyes. With a lost gaze, he replied that he wasn't feeling well and preferred to spend some time alone. Upon hearing this, Tudor's look filled with fear and confusion. He didn't know why Vakar wanted to spend time alone. With a happy expression, Piggy began pointing at himself with his finger, deciding to go to the room with Vakar. Sancho's attention, who was behind them, focused on Piggy. Tudor started covering poor Piggy's mouth with his hand, and with a forced smile, decided to leave Vakar alone since alone time was important. Poor Piggy couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. With a calm and lost expression, our boy thanked them. Some time later, Vakar went to his bedroom and closed the door. He sat in front of the table, and using his hands, he began to open the backpack. He couldn't help but feel calm since that day. He hadn't had time to be alone, and hadn't even been able to organize himself properly. With a lost gaze, he started observing his backpack. The level of swordmaster that he had reached with the blessing of the saintess had faded because after that day, he had returned to being a supreme graduate. But after all, it had been good for him to experience the level of swordmaster. He reached into the backpack and began rummaging around, and the greatest reward from this fight was what he had obtained while battling against the knights. He took out the masks that Dantalion's guards were carrying. These were leather sacks, and when the 4 sacks came together, they formed a large mask and, according to our boy's memory, this relic was something special. Once the masks were joined, it transformed into a mask with the face of a dog. It was a mask of human faces, and from the depths of the heart of rank O, plus called human face in beast form. He would never have thought he would obtain a relic comparable to Beelzebub's demonic sword. He had seen in a book before regressing that it was a mask whose power grew stronger the more it killed its own people. It was said that the more people the user killed, the more powerful it would become, and furthermore, it had an inexplicable level of recovery and aura accumulation. Vakar took the mask out of the backpack and began to observe it with a curious look. He decided to try it on. And despite believing that it was written there were some side effects, for him it was better to take the risk. Without wasting a second, he put on the mask and his eyes became those of a bloodthirsty killer. His resistance and aura, which had been stripped away during the fight with Dantalion, had recovered. Unlike the regenerative abilities of swamp salamanders, which were excellent at regenerating limbs, this mask restored our boy's stamina and fatigue. Vakar now felt that he was in a dark place. He went on alert and his gaze fixed to one side. He felt a strange sensation. Now the table seemed much bigger. Vakar's attention focused on the backpack. He didn't know why his gaze had become so low, and moreover now his vision was in black and white. The reality was that our boy had turned into an adorable dog, and now his clothes were somewhat big on him. Vakar's eyes filled with confusion, realizing that these were the side effects of using the mask. He got down from the chair and started running in circles. If his body didn't return to normal, he was going to be in serious trouble. He had to take off the mask as soon as possible. Little by little, Vakar's method began to take effect, and the mask started coming off. Feeling this, he began to gaze at the ground in confusion. In a matter of seconds, the mask detached from his body, making him return to normal. He began to observe his hand, and his eyes filled with curiosity. If he showed the will to remove the mask, it would come off. The mask fell to the ground, and our boy's attention fixed on it. If the mask had the ability to turn our boy into a dog at any moment he wanted, he realized that it was more of a subability than a side effect. Luckily, there was no rule stating that animals couldn't be kept inside the academy dormitory. Thanks to this, he would be able to use the mask easily here. At that moment, he began to feel a strange energy, his attention fixed on the open backpack that was on top of the table. Vakar became curious, not knowing where this energy was coming from. Our boy put his hand inside the backpack and took out an egg that was hatching. He started observing the egg carefully, placed his hand over his chest, and remembered that this was Madame's egg, and the movement at this moment was a sign of hatching. Previously, while playing, Perry had dropped the egg into the water. The 8-legged Madame was a super high-level monster against whom our boy had almost died several times during their fight. Even for the ancient demons who ruled hell, she was someone difficult to deal with. There also existed a story that monsters like her were guaranteed a space to live in a corner of the depths of the abyss. One of the descendants of this monster was waking up now. At that moment, little by little a small spider began to emerge from the egg. Several seconds later, the egg hatched completely, and out came a small and adorable spider, very different from her mother. With a tender look, the little spider started to look at our boy. Vakar began to observe the spider. He couldn't believe that this little thing resembling a cotton ball was Madame's baby. The little spider began to cry, and upon seeing this, Vakar's mind filled with confusion, but it didn't take him long to realize that this crying was something she had learned from the wolves while the egg was in the deep forest. The little spider's eyes filled with sadness, and then she began to cry and lose strength, and upon seeing this, our boy realized that she was hungry. He took out some meat he had stored in his backpack, broke it into small pieces, and left it on the table. The little spider jumped onto the table and started shaking her body. Vakar began to observe her carefully. He had thought that she ate meat just like her mother, but now he realized that the young ones did not eat meat. The spider climbed back onto Vakar's hand and started to feel dizzy due to hunger. With a calm look, he decided to take this opportunity to raise an S-rank monster from the deep forest, but for now, he needed to find some food. He hid the small spider in his clothes, left his room, and started walking down the hallway. But just as he was about to turn a corner, something caught his attention. Someone asked a commoner not to muddy the waters of the academy. Our boy hid behind the wall and peeked his head around the corner. Several intimidating boys were standing in front of poor Piggy. The boy with the ponytail grabbed Piggy by the shoulder and started to smile, and upon seeing this, poor Piggy couldn't help but panic and start to feel afraid. While on the other side, the man with purple hair who had his arms crossed began to stare at him silently. He was Grenule from Leviathan of the Fire Corps, among the 7 families that represented the Empire. He was from the Leviathan family, an extremely venomous hermit. Vakar had heard that he was the first-year vice president of the Fire Corps and was considered to be the most arrogant person. Piggy began to touch his neck with his hand, and with a forced smile, he turned his back on them and started to walk away, apologizing and explaining that he had just come to the bathroom for a moment and that his friends were waiting for him. At first, they remained silent, but just then, Grenule and his friend appeared in front of Piggy and began to look at him with a piercing gaze. The boy with the ponytail put his hand in front of Grenule, indicating not to act, and with an arrogant expression called Piggy a commoner and asked where he was planning to go. The Grenule approached Piggy and couldn't help but get angry upon seeing that someone with such a simple appearance thought so highly of himself. For him, having to go to the academy with people like Piggy was disgusting, asking if he realized the great insult this represented for someone like him, a descendant of the 7 great families. Piggy's eyes filled with fear. He began looking down at the ground in silence, with an arrogant look. Grenouille mentioned that his existence did not fit in this place, asking him to leave the academy. He didn't even want to imagine what Piggy's friends were like, thinking they must be just like him. Upon hearing this, Piggy's gaze turned furious. He could not allow this bastard to insult his friends. Without losing a second, he grabbed Grenouille by the collar, and upon seeing this, he couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly in rage, as he couldn't believe that a commoner was doing this. Fury consumed Piggy's mind, and with a piercing look, he made it clear that he didn't care if they spoke like that about him. But he wasn't going to let anyone insult his friends. Grenouille began observing Piggy's behavior in silence, and then veins appeared on his face. With an enraged gaze, he asked if Piggy really thought he'd leave him alone after this. Using his hand, he pushed Piggy back, turned to his friend, and gave the order to crush him. Upon hearing this order, his friend clenched his fist and prepared to strike. Piggy closed his eyes and braced himself for the blow, but several seconds passed, and he was never hit by it. Consumed by curiosity, he began to open his eyes. It was Tudor who had blocked the attack from Grenouille's subordinate. He turned to Piggy and with a worried look asked if he was okay. At that moment, someone muscular placed his hand on top of the head of Grenouille's other friend, causing the boy to panic, not knowing what was happening. It was Sancho. He grabbed the boy's head firmly, and his eyes filled with rage, revealing that if what they wanted was a test of strength, they had chosen the wrong opponent. The boy began to scream in pain. Seeing this, Piggy's eyes filled with surprise. He couldn't believe that Tudor and Sancho were defending him. Piggy fell to the ground, and at that moment Vakar appeared behind him and placed his hands on his shoulders to help him stand up. Upon seeing Vakar, Piggy couldn't help but be left speechless. He couldn't believe that even Vakar had come to defend him. Upon seeing Tudor, Grenouille couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly, and his eyes filled with rage. Tudor, Sancho, and Vakar stood next to Piggy with a piercing expression. Tudor finally realized why Piggy was taking so long to return. Sancho began staring intently at Grenouille, and Piggy couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. Tudor's eyes filled with rage. He couldn't believe that Grenouille had dared to touch his friend. Piggy panicked upon hearing this. Sancho started cracking his fingers and began showing a piercing expression, ready to fight, while on the other side, our boy showed no emotion. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,